Welcome to another episode of the Mideast News Hour. Um, this is my last week in the United States before I go home, and as you can see, I have two incredible women of valor here with me on this show, both former senior national security advisors in the Trump administration. First, I don't know what's going to come up randomly with the Zoom, but I have Victoria Coates. Dr. Coates was the Deputy National Security Advisor to the president during the Trump administration, and that's Simone Ledeen. She was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. And I asked Victoria and Simone, sorry, I don't even know if I said your name, Simone Ledeen, who is now a senior fellow at the Purdue University's Cratch Center for Tech Diplomacy, and Victoria Coates, who is a senior fellow at the Heritage Institute. And the reason, aside from the fact that you're both good friends of mine, old friends of mine, I wanted to have you on this week because we're marking a year since the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And there are other important developments, mainly, and we'll talk about it, whether they flow from that, which is the Iran nuclear deal, which looks like it's reaching fruition, and also an interesting development in Turkish-Israeli relations, which is that they've renewed diplomatic ties and are now exchanging ambassadors, I think, for the first time since 2011. And that's going to have implications as well for Middle Eastern gas industry. And Victoria, you were very involved with that during the Trump years as the senior advisor to the Secretary of Energy as well. So without further ado, I wanted to start with the withdrawal from Afghanistan a year ago, and I wanted to start with you, Simone. I mean, as I see it, and I'd like to talk about it, hear what you guys have to say. There were extraordinary implications for this withdrawal, both for the U.S. military, for U.S. global standing, for regional security, and for the superpower competition. So, Simone, you were deployed in Afghanistan cumulatively for over 2 years, I believe, and you were very close to the events on the ground as they were happening. So you want to take it whichever way or whatever order you want to take it. But I would actually like it if you would start with the U.S. military and how you think that the withdrawal after 20 years, the way that it was done, impacted the American military.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you today, you and Victoria. So I appreciate very much the opportunity to talk about these things with you. Yeah, I was deployed several times, cumulatively about 2 years. I was embedded with and served with the military as a civilian, and I traveled all over the country, stayed all over the country, was deployed to work on projects all over the country, including some pretty remote places. And I was there, my first tour was in 2005. So I was there in quote unquote the early days before a lot of the violence started. So I was able to see a pretty significant deterioration from the beginning, when I first deployed to my last deployment, which indeed was 10 years before the withdrawal. My final deployment was 2009 to 2010. So, starting with the military, I mean, when it was clear, there were many, many signs leading up to August of last year that the withdrawal was going to be a complete collapse and overwhelming calamity for our Afghan partners and for us as well, if you include the moral injury that so many of us have felt. So we witnessed this, and so many people, I think in good faith, tried to raise, including a lot of veterans, tried to raise concerns, within the government to government officials, friends that were still serving, saying, hey, we're seeing this. Hey, why did you cancel the contracts that are supposed to replenish, fuel, food, water, ammunition for the Afghan forces? Fine, they're the ones that are fighting now as we withdraw, but they still need the support that we had provided from day one. that we had promised to continue providing, that President Biden indeed said he would continue to provide. So overwhelmingly, I think we're faced with the reality that there was never any intention to assist the Afghans once the decision was made to leave. And really, once President Biden came to office, he had campaigned on withdrawal from Afghanistan. And indeed, those of us who lived through the Obama years, I was, 2009 to 2010, President Obama was in charge, and he indeed determined that there was a big review that went on while I was over there. General McChrystal conducted the review. Do we need more troops? Do we need less troops? I don't know if your viewers recall, but that was a very big deal at the time. And General McChrystal ultimately recommended an increase in troops, which President Obama agreed to. This was something that then Vice President Biden fought against every step of the way and ultimately lost. And it seems to me and a lot of other observers that this was an emotional issue for him at the end of the day. And he felt like he was righting a wrong that was done to him, maybe personally. And therefore, as things collapsed, and it was so clear that everything was collapsing, even, like I said, long before the actual end date of our time in Afghanistan, he would not change his mind. He would not review anything. He would not update anything. It was just execute, 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 no matter what happens, no matter the danger to our troops, as we saw mortal danger. And so that's what we were left with. And for a lot of veterans that I know personally, many people still can't talk about it. It's just too emotional. A lot of people have spent tens of thousands of their own dollars in helping their Afghan partners to leave Afghanistan, even hide in a third country until they can get their visas and stuff taken care of so they can come here or go to a safer third country. But it's actually not over yet for a lot of people. It's ongoing still.
And can I ask you, I know a lot of people have argued, well, President Trump wanted to withdraw U.S. forces from Afghanistan. He intended to withdraw all U.S. forces from Afghanistan. Why is what Biden did different from what would have happened, say, if President Trump had a second term and had been able to go forward with the withdrawal that he had been promising and had been intending to undertake, really also since he entered office?
Well, I think it's easy to say, could have, should have, would have. I think certainly there's an agreement that the Doha agreement was potentially a mistake, but I think everyone, including President Trump, has recognized that the Taliban was not at all sticking to what they agreed to do. So I think, a comparison could be made. Again, it's easy to say, Trump would have done things differently but based on my observation, President Trump has always been very savvy in terms of public opinion and understands and would have understood at the time that it was such a colossal failure on so many levels that certain things had to be changed, and plans would be changed, updated, adjusted along the way, as in military planning everything always is. And the example I would use for that is a withdrawal from Syria. At a certain point in the Trump administration, President Trump got very frustrated with our military defense leadership that was not executing what he had asked for, which was a withdrawal from Syria, or an explanation for why we were not doing that. They were slow rolling him, and he got frustrated by this and just said, "We're done, we're leaving, let's go." Now, he listened during this time to advisors who ran to the White House, and perhaps Victoria, you were one of them at the time, saying, here are the reasons why this is bad. Here are the reasons why this is not a good idea. One of the big reasons is the safety of the state of Israel and a lot of nefarious Iranian actors that are running around Syria still, and the protection that U.S. troops are able to provide there, given the very unstable situation on that border. So I think President Trump listened. He listened and he adjusted and he changed his mind and he changed his order. So there is a history of him doing that, and I don't see why, watching the disaster unfold in Afghanistan, knowing how much he cares about public opinion, and knowing how much he cares about our men and women in uniform, that it's hard to imagine he wouldn't have adjusted, even if he had given that order at the time. Which when we left, there was no.
I'd love it. Yeah, would you chime in, Victoria, and give your thoughts on it? Both on this specific question and also more generally on, I mean, I'd really like to widen the discussion also to the implications of what happened last year.
There are just a couple of data points that I think are just in support of what Simone was saying. For starters, there's about 10 years of polling leading up to last summer, which suggests the American people supported a withdrawal to the tune of 70-80%, bipartisan. And, that is certainly what drove, President Trump's interest in withdrawal. And I think it's what dictated for President Biden that he was going to do this come hell or high water. But in terms of what Trump might have done to adjust, and I think that's where you really can find fault with President Biden, it was the failure to adjust when it was clearly going sideways. When we went to Iraq with President Trump in Christmas of 2018 and landed at Al-Assad Air Base, he was very impressed by it. He was impressed by the quality of our generals who were there, who briefed them, and also just by the base. He's a real estate guy. And he was like, this is amazing. And he looked at me at one point and he said, why would we ever give this up? And I said, sir, we wouldn't. As far as I'm concerned, this is sovereign U.S. territory and I can do whatever I want from it. And I would never, ever give up that flexibility. We paid whatever it was, however many billions of dollars to build it. So I think if he had been briefed on the location and capabilities of Bagram, both in terms of our capabilities and also what we could prevent other people from doing, he would have very readily agreed to that 2,500 number that General McKenzie has claimed that was on the table as an option for President Biden. I would be shocked if he had insisted on abandoning that base, because the other thing he was very clear about is we were not going to leave anything behind. He used to say, not a pencil. And so, the additional revelations that have come out in the last couple of days of what was left there in terms of very usable things for the Taliban, light arms and things that even the Taliban can figure out and use, it's really shameful. And I think those are two places where President Trump pretty much had demonstrated he would not have done this.
I think that, and I'm never quite clear whether the what is it, $90 billion of weaponry that the United States left behind, whether it's such a large number, it's such an enormous quantity of arms of all types, that you wonder whether it's a tactical failure or a strategic one, whether at a certain point it becomes strategic. I know that our friend Adam Credo from the Washington Free Beacon reported last week that you had special forces, Afghan special forces, who were actually trained in the United States, and they knew doctrine and also personnel in U.S. special forces, and that they fled to Iran after the U.S. withdrawal, which could also signal a real operational failure for the Americans. But when you look at the amount of hardware and weapons, airplanes, helicopters, missiles, all the ammunition, all of the guns that the Americans left behind, how do you see this as how do you see the implications of this? Where do you see the ripple effect coming back, or first of all, appearing in the region and also coming back to slap the United States? Victoria, you want to take this first?
I mean, just real quick, I mean, I think I defer to Simone on this issue. What the military will tell you, to my understanding, is it's cheaper to leave it than wrap it up and bring it back. And that they're trying to do whatever is the most expeditious and the most efficient. I think the problem is both in terms of the Taliban using it and then psychologically, to see them running around with our stuff, marked USA, is really psychologically damaging. And I just, it doesn't seem to me that decision was particularly well thought through.
But you don't think that, and so here's the question, and also for you, Simone, to answer. Were the weapons of were weapons that were left behind things that would be of interest to the Iranians, to the Russians, to the Chinese? Because we had that drone that fell in Iranian hands under the Obama administration, and Obama didn't demand that it be returned to the United States after, I think, the Iranians shot it down. I can't even remember anymore. But then shortly thereafter, the Iranians were able to reverse engineer it, and a lot of the Iranian drones are based on the technology of the intercepted US drone. So the question here is whether the stuff that the United States did leave behind could represent that sort of a threat.
Well, they're always interested in that sort of thing, and I'm sure there's information they could get out of them. My assumption, and again, Simone will be able to answer this better, is that these would be export versions. If you're going to send them overseas into a high-risk theater like this, that you would have already taken precautions to have it be very difficult to reverse engineer. And that's a very serious business that the Pentagon is in. But as I said, I'd defer to you, Simone, on whether you thought there would be a lot of technological value to our enemies in that stash.
No, you put yourself on mute, Simone. You got.
I think when you're sorry, there's a rainstorm here. There's a lot of thunder. So I think when you're talking about small arms, there's not so much an issue of, that's not so much an issue, export control. But when it comes to things like NODs, night vision, so especially the special operations forces did have pretty sophisticated night vision. And now the Taliban have it, the Taliban, whoever they've sold it to. There are many instances like that. Also, just the sheer volume, not only of small arms, but of night vision, suppressors, all different sorts of things that we had added to the Afghans kit over the years. And not to mention, helicopters and different, as you mentioned, UAVs, different forms of transport. In the early days, a lot of people were saying, well, the Taliban don't know how to fly Black Hawk. Well, a lot, they're members of the Afghan army that joined the Taliban, and they know how to fly them because we train them. So I think that's in my opinion, sort of a false argument. But the reporting actually was based on, the news reporting was actually based on an important report that was just published last week by House Republicans who had a boatload of whistleblowers come forward and give interviews on what they saw and experienced, and provided some facts that the State Department and the White House have been stonewalling on. And that's where a lot of this data that was reported on came from, including the fact that hundreds of Afghan special forces who were trained here in the US have had to flee to Iran because we did not prioritize moving them even to a third country. So they moved themselves. Now, I will say some of the veterans' efforts have been successful in moving many hundreds of these troops out. And again, these are private efforts, not US government efforts, but there were so many, and a lot of them left. I think also left on their own and had to go to Iran because the other borders were really closed, or various security reasons. So, but I think ultimately time will tell. I think our stuff is going to be popping up for years now, as it did before. We've seen this movie before, unfortunately. And, stay tuned. I don't think it's going to be a happy ending. Now you're muted.
You're muted, Carolyn.
I'm muted. Sorry. The other thing, that was the other thing that I wanted to talk about, which was about where it's going to pop up, which is China, right? Because there was at least some talk early on, and I would assume that it was based on fact that the Chinese were looking into taking over Bagram, and that they were developing some fairly close ties with the Taliban. Do you have anything to, any insight into that and the implications China taking over Bagram Air Force for air base for the balance of power between the United States and China, and the balance of power for China in the region?
I mean, giving up Bagram was a grave strategic error. And, Bagram was our base when we first invaded Afghanistan and fought the Taliban after 9/11. Bagram was a key place for us in our initial invasion plan. Now, we put billions of dollars into Bagram. I spent a lot of time on that base myself, and it's in great shape. Now, I'm sure on the way out they did, they removed a lot, but still it's in great shape. The runways, a lot of the technical stuff that you need, like radars and stuff for aircraft landing and taking off, you just bring in your own systems and you can just start it up again. So, a lot of the more complex systems that we had, they can't restart them. They're going to have to rebuild them or build them from scratch if the Chinese have those capabilities, many of which we know they do have. But it will take some time. But yeah, we walked away from that. And I still really can't believe, it's hard for me even a year later to believe that we gave up Bagram. We just walked away from it. I remember many times being there and thinking we're gonna be here forever, just because of the massive size, the infrastructure that we had built there. So it still is hard to believe that we gave it up. But anyway, the Chinese would be hard to understand why they wouldn't take over Bagram, unless their relationship with the Taliban is still tenuous enough that the Taliban don't want the Chinese presence there in such a important capacity. That would really be, in my opinion, the only reason why they wouldn't be able to take over Bagram. And again, I think time will tell. Perhaps they'll partner on running the airfield. I don't know right now.
Can you just take a step back and tell me what does control over Bagram give you on the ground, for people who aren't intimately aware of what was the importance of Bagram, operational, strategic, from the perspective of controlling, I don't know, the airspace or whatever.
Really, it goes down to the bottom line, just for in the interest of time, is the size and number of runways is unmatched in the region. There are only a few other places, and especially because Bagram is for us, Bagram's in between Russia and China. So as we look to, great power competition, understanding, and by the way, I was fully supportive of leaving Afghanistan. After what I saw my last tour there, 2009 to 2010, it was clear that we should start packing up. And we had another 10 years there because, again, a lot of people were not telling the truth about what was going on the ground there. But be that as it may, at this point, again, and this is why it is so shocking that we just walked away from Bagram, it is geographically right in the middle between China and Russia. And so as we are pivoting toward great power competition, or whatever the US government is calling it these days, that would have been a critical base of operations for us, as we shift. And we could run any kind of operation out of there, and I'll just leave it at that. And we just walked away from it.
Just to
All right,
kind of take
yeah, I want you to come back in, and then after you're done, I want Simone, if you could just quickly tell us why you knew in 2009 that the U.S. had to leave. That'd be great, because otherwise you're just leaving us hanging. But first, Victoria, if you could speak to what you were saying about Bagram in China and what the implications are if they come in, or if they have
just
come in.
to the China piece, I think the presence of a very significant state-owned Chinese mining entity in Kabul is the critical indicator you need that China's just moving right on in there. And the funny thing about Afghanistan is, and I think this is what Simone will speak very eloquently to, is deeply, deeply dysfunctional, but it is not without resources. And most of those resources are in the form of rare earths, which has been a very hot topic of conversation, with the developing competition between the United States and China. And I had long been of the opinion that if we, took a more entrepreneurial approach to this, and rather than trying to train the Afghans to, grow pomegranates or whatever, avocado, that we would do much better to get major U.S. industrial concerns involved in developing those resources and, making sure we had the, right to be the first bidder on them. That you could have developed something there that could have been a going concern and eventually brought, a lot of prosperity to Afghanistan if the Afghans wanted it. But now that is all just going to go straight into the hands of the Chinese. And I think, they might not particularly like each other, but the Taliban and the PRC are going to see a lot of common interest there. And in a way, the control of Bagram becomes then just a symbol of a broader synergy that's not going to be very friendly to us.
Okay, so Simone, what was all that about?
So yes, that was a great point, Victoria, and we can go all the way back to the incident, by the way, with the INAC copper mine, which was in 2009, I believe, which was the first time that the Chinese actually won a contract from the Afghan government for mining of copper. And we saw, and the Afghans saw back then, that the Chinese didn't hire any Afghan workers. They imported, this is their standard, they imported Chinese workers. And the Afghan government saw zero benefit from this in the end, other than the bribes that the Chinese paid up front, which goes to the point that I was making about why in 2009, 2010, I mean, at that time, I was the senior treasury rep to ISAF. And so a lot of what I worked on was anti-corruption.
ISAF is the International Security Force in Afghanistan. Is that what it is?
Yes, that was the NATO command in Afghanistan. So I was working for the military, but for the Treasury Department. And Treasury has an intelligence department, and so I was supporting the military, but helping them to understand a lot of the financial flows in the country, which I had previously worked on for many years at that time. So, for example, the commander wanted to understand better, how is the Taliban making money? And so we had to do kind of a deep dive on how is the Taliban making money. And the drug trade was a significant source of revenue for them, but so was corruption, the endemic corruption that existed there. We were able to identify some clear nodes, like the big nodes for the Taliban, of where they were getting a lot of revenue. A lot of it was bribes, like shakedowns, threatening violence unless you pay me, that sort of thing. And it really added up, And so at the end of the day, a lot of the trucking companies, logistics companies that were bringing in supplies for us were actually funding the Taliban at the same time. So that was a very unpleasant message to deliver, but it was something that was understood, back in 2009, 2010. And unfortunately, presidents change, commanders change, And a lot of these things were lost, whereas the commander at the time was very focused on dealing with this issue. Was was the next guy, was it just sort of died on the vine from my perspective, and was never really addressed. And there were reports that mentioned, corruption, and also things like not just the supply lines, but also things like ghost soldiers. So, you have a big roster of, okay, we have this number of soldiers in the Afghan National Army, so pay for them needs to be this. Here's how it breaks down, per battalion, per unit. But actually, in reality, there were a lot of ghost names there, names that didn't actually belong to people. And all of those salaries went to the commanders. And so it was in the commander's interest not to mention that there were ghost soldiers. So all of this led to, the population them seeing that this wasn't working for them, that there were the officials that were getting rich, and the population, the situation for them was not improving. They were still under threat by the Taliban. They were still living, subsistence existence. And it just, things weren't getting better the way that they had expected. And so, again, at a certain point, one has to ask, what are we doing? What are we doing here? Why are we doing this? If we're not going to change the way that we're doing this, we should go. And why are we sending our men and women here, for lethal operations? At the end of the day, maybe there's a smaller footprint. We could do things in a different way where we're not in this endless, never-ending cycle. We're just feeding the wrong things more and more. So I'm sure there's a more eloquent way of saying that, but I certainly came to that realization. And actually, that's why I left the government in 2014 and went on to do other things. But I saw in President Trump the opportunity to actually do some good, some real good, and change a lot of this way of doing business, which is why I went back into government.
Victoria, do you have anything to add to that? Because I kind of want to talk about the different way that Trump did business with Iran, and use that just to sort of pivot away from Afghanistan and the terrible story that is that country and the U.S. experience there, particularly the end of the U.S. experience there, but not only, and move on to what's happening now with Iran. But there, and then there is just one little thing that I really do want to talk about, which goes to the heart of what Biden did a year ago, which is what it did to America's reputation as a global power, America's standing as a global power in the Middle East and in the world. And there are people who claim that Russia and its invasion of Ukraine had something to do with the way that the United States left Afghanistan and the weakness that it radiated outwards for the message that it sent to American enemies or what and allies alike. So
yeah,
you want to take it away?
Absolutely. No, that was actually the last point I wanted to make, that I not surprisingly agree with Simone that this is far from over. I had the opportunity to field a couple of questions in a recent poll the TIPP Insights did, and the data was interesting in terms of how the cross-section understood the ramifications of Afghanistan, and well over half of them said this was a generational strategic setback, both parties. The other thing they agreed on, interestingly, the most strongly, was the potential of Afghanistan to be the site of future attacks on American interests or America itself. That something like 70% of the respondents thought that was a likely outcome. So, the concerns about this, Biden's attempt to sort of spin it as a great success, not even the Zawahiri hit, notwithstanding. I think the concerns are deep, and I think that they're justified. I do think Putin was like, well, it's open season. I can do whatever I want, because, they're so weakened. They're in such disarray. And then what's interesting there is you could say it led to his own, massive miscalculation, which is going to wind up being extremely expensive and challenging for Russia. So, maybe there's a tiny inkling of silver lining there, but overall, I think it really was horrific. It put us back in 1974 kind of mindset, and I think we are now living through, the middle 70s again, and all of their challenges and missteps. The good news is that hopefully 1980 is coming.
Yeah, hopefully 1980 is coming, but you first, you had the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan first, and
the Iranian Revolution, to get to your next topic.
And let's get to my least favorite but most frequent subject of discussion, which is Iran. Because the same Biden that threw 20 years of American efforts in Afghanistan into the garbage and undermined America's standing globally and particularly in the region is now, according to the media reports of the leaked agreements that he's already agreed to with the Iranians, he's ready to basically give Iran almost everything that they're demanding. And some of these I wrote in my article last week in JNS. I mean, they have profound implications on the whole non-proliferation regime that has been developed over the past 75 years by the United States and its allies. I mean, the Iranians are demanding an end to the International Atomic Energy Agency inspections of and investigations into Iran's undeclared nuclear operations, which are all being done of course, in breach of Iran's signature on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And by agreeing to essentially end these IAEA investigations of Iran for its illegal behavior, Biden is telling everybody that there are no more rules to nuclear non-proliferation. We're giving up. Everybody is for themselves. We are entering an age that every American leader tried to prevent since the dawn of the nuclear era, which is we are in the dawn of an age of nuclear chaos with the proliferation of nuclear capabilities, technologies, know-how internationally, and there are no rules anymore. I mean, that's what I wrote in my article. And how do you see us going forward from here? Start with you, Victoria.
Well, I think I take maybe a slightly different tack on it, Carolyn. My feeling has been, since the North Koreans tested a reasonably small device, that this agreement, one way or the other, was meaningless. That if the Iranians determined they wanted a nuclear weapon, they could buy it from the North Koreans. They're on the market. We know they talk. Up until now, the Iranians have been given pause by the fact that the North Korean material tends not to be terribly high quality. But if they were truly determined and they wanted a nuclear weapon, they could get one. So we can tie ourselves into knots over an agreement like this and make all sorts of angels dance on heads of pins, but it is ultimately meaningless for that reason. One point I did want to make, though, as we were getting more and more details about the concessions that the administration made, there were two things that jumped out at me. One was this notion that in the event that a future administration refused to comply with the deal, there would be some massive payment to the Iranians for that non-compliance, and B, there would be a prohibition on additional sanctions on non-Iranian companies doing business with Iran. There's no way to enforce that. It needs to be said loud and clear. Unless they pass this through the Senate as a treaty, which will cost them 67 votes that they don't have, that is not enforceable. I don't care what kind of, the trap they try to put in it. A future president would simply say, I am not paying this blood money. And I retain the right to sanction whomever I please. I am not bound by this agreement. And one other just quick quibble, because I think it's important, is the non-proliferation treaty absolutely was, is an actual treaty. The JCPOA was never signed by anyone. And this thing isn't going to be signed by anyone. It's going to be implemented through the United Nations Security Council, which hopefully does not and never will have, binding legal authority over the United States government. So the whole thing, because of the way they've structured it, because they refuse to try to pass it as a treaty, they can't make any of these claims. And I think all of us who rightly oppose the deal need to make that extremely clear, as these details trickle out.
Can I just make a quibble to what you said, Victoria? Because I think, I was looking at it and what will a new president do? And obviously this is unconstitutional to constrain the hands of a future president when this isn't a treaty that's been ratified by the Senate. But maybe the idea is they don't really care. I mean, I don't really, if you think about it, just as a vehicle for transferring an enormous amount of money to Iran in exchange for an increase in Iranian oil exports, which will bring down the price of oil, then it doesn't really matter what they write there, because the Iranians said last month that they already crossed the nuclear threshold and that they can build a bomb within weeks anytime that they decide that they want to do so. So in a way, I feel like if you think that it's beside the point from the moment that North Korea conducted its first nuclear test because they can just sell nuclear bombs to Iran or anybody else who wants to pay them, that's one thing. But here you have the Iranians saying that under the guise of this agreement, we've already stockpiled enough highly enriched uranium to develop bombs whenever we want. So none of this actually matters. It's just a way to humiliate the United States. I mean, I don't know. That's my takeaway from this, because who cares if it's already over? Then this is just,
it's political posturing. They're trying to get a victory. They're trying to lower gas prices. That's all it is. I strongly agree.
What do you think, Simone? You have to unmute yourself.
I know. Yeah, I always mute myself when Victoria is talking Iran, because I just agree with everything that she says. I do think it's important to call it blood money, and I do think it's important to reiterate that this is not enforceable, that trying to hold any future administration to any monstrosity that's going to be agreed to right now is not, it's not going to hold. So they're operating in this vacuum, but it's obviously an extremely dangerous vacuum. And I agree. They can actually, the Iranians can, develop a nuclear weapon at any point that they choose. And according to various news reports, they're fairly close to doing it. And there's so many worrisome things in the leaked details of this latest potential agreement, but trying to remove the IAEA from being able to do their investigations and assessments is, I mean, we all understand how dangerous that is, and there's only one purpose for doing that. And so being able to hold the Iranians to account for anything with respect to a nuclear program is going to be impossible. So it's not the point. So what are they really playing at? This is my question. What is the administration really playing at when they're removing any possible way to at least share with the public what the Iranian nuclear program is doing? Because the IAEA publishes, they have public reports. All the information that our government has is, extremely highly classified. And so that would be protected and no one else would really have the ability to know about it. Obviously, there are a few other countries that are following this from the intelligence perspective, but it's so nefarious and it's all happening so out in the open. It's a very dire situation, very dire.
I want to bring it. I'm sorry, I shouldn't interrupt you, but I wanted to bring it to a question of U.S. allies that are getting spurned in an absolutely disastrous way, and obviously the one foremost in my mind is Israel, but it isn't only Israel; it's also the Gulf states, and I dare say Egypt and others. And I'm wondering, over the past week, I've had a couple of different discussions with people, and it's funny to hear people's various views of things. One person was saying to me, well, Israel and the Sunnis can, work together to bypass what the Americans are doing to fight Iran to block their path to regional hegemony. And another was saying they have absolutely no capacity to do anything and they're bit players. And actually, this is the central question that's been animating Israel's own foreign policy debate if you take it to its basic foundational level, which is, can Israel actually impact the situation or not? And, it's roughly divided between right and left, although that's not exact. But the basic idea is that the left, the political left, the strategic left in Israel is of the sense that we can't impact this and that this is an American problem. It's too big for Israel to handle. And the right, and again, this is a broad thing because it's a strategic question, far less than a political one. But that the right, broadly speaking, says no, we're an actor here and we're capable of impacting what's happening. As American policymakers in national security that have a lot of experience dealing with the Middle East, how do you view the capability of American allies in the region who are being screwed by this? What is their capacity to impact now, given where the Biden administration is on the issue? Who wants to start? Neither of you. Okay, Victoria, so you're on the hot seat first.
Okay, well, I think, you're pointing out there's so many fatal flaws in the way we got to the JCPOA and the way that we're getting to whatever the Frankenstein version of it that's coming together now. It's hard to pinpoint one fatal flaw, but the fact that we listen to the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese instead of our close regional partners and allies who are looking across the Gulf at this threat. And, one of the things that was interesting for me earlier this year was taking an Israeli friend to Bahrain and UAE. He had never been east of the Jordan River and, sitting out on the Gulf in Abu Dhabi. And he's like, it's right there. I said, I know. They look at it all day, every day. And, that feeling of proximity and the knowledge of what they're capable of it really focuses the mind. And so I think that was a huge failure in negotiating this deal without the region at the table. And so that is an enormous problem in terms of Israel's capabilities. I think, that I've heard that debate myself and participated in it in various fora. I think the results of the Israeli elections upcoming will be very interesting to kind of take the pulse of the Israeli people and how they understand that debate, because obviously this is going to be a critical issue going into that election. And the other thing that I think is different now from what it was in 2015, in both cases, Israel was dealing with a U.S. administration in which it had little, if any, confidence. And certainly, again, fallout from Afghanistan has made that even more acute in this circumstance. But now Israel has the overt alliance with countries like UAE and Bahrain. And, I haven't talked to them about how having, permission to use Saudi airspace, ability to partner with the UAE, how that enhances capabilities in the absence of robust U.S. support. And I think it's something they're just starting to really explore and figure out what might be possible. But that's one thing that I know keeps the Iranians up at night. And so it's something we should be doing everything we can to encourage.
How about you, Simone?
Well, as usual, I agree. I think to add to what Victoria said, when you look at the array of potential actions that regional allies can take, I think there are many different things that are on the table. Certainly the US, if we were in a position if we had our leadership had the political will to actually try to counter Iranian activity rather than prop it up, Iranian malign activity and including the developing of a nuclear weapon, but also including regional terrorism and other things. we have the power of the US dollar. And so our sanctions are still the most effective way to do that. Okay, so that's right now off the table, unfortunately. And that's not something that, Israel or Saudi Arabia or anyone else in the region can really do. They just don't have that power. But there are a lot of other things that can be done. I think Israel is very skilled at some of them and has actually conducted some of these kinds of operations in the past. Those are important because a lot of these Iranian networks are
You mean terror networks?
Yeah, the Iranian terror networks, but also some of these like some of the scientists as well, these networks of scientists, that they're trust-based networks. And if there's, if they start doubting each other for a variety of reasons, then that actually weakens the entire network. And we saw that when we were, seriously conducting counterterrorism operations ourselves, the US. But these are things that can be done. And, some of these even smaller Gulf countries, for example, do have very skilled intelligence services. They operate in parts of the world, unique parts of the world. So I do think that there are, there are things that can be done, and there are ways to impose pressure that maybe aren't as direct and public, and maybe have the same sort of immediate effect that U.S. sanctions have. But I don't think that those should be discounted. And I think sometimes if there's a degree of deniability, then the juice is worth the squeeze, right? That it could be risky, but less risky if you don't have any fingerprints. So I actually am a big fan of those kinds of things, and I've been on the record for years as being a big fan of those kinds of things because they're very effective. And when you don't have the big power of the U.S. behind you, you have to be more creative. And I will also say, that while the administration may be in one camp, our Congress, hopefully both houses, but certainly one in the near future, will be trying to figure out ways to help and ways to sort of try to roll back as much as possible any of these sort of really pro-Iran activities that the administration is engaged in right now. So that could be another avenue to at least get some U.S. support as much as possible, given current constraints. Just to add to what Victoria said.
I think that both of you, if I may, I think both of you are pointing to the direction that nobody here is an object, that everybody has stuff that they can do, some more than others, but that just because the United States is in a different phase of it, where it does in fact want to realign itself towards Iran and away from its traditional allies, doesn't mean that the traditional allies now are stuck, hopeless and helpless and without the means to do anything. I think that there's plenty of ways to skin a cat. But one of those ways really is to build operational alliances with unlikely people. And in this case, we see the unlikely reinstatement of Israeli-Turkish ties over the past week, where Erdogan just 2 weeks ago was accusing Israel during the brief operation in Gaza against Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Iranian proxy in Gaza. He was accusing Israel of killing children and women and puppies and guppies or whatever. He was up to his own tricks, essentially saying that Israel is a Nazi state because he is a Muslim Brotherhood Jew hater. And now all of a sudden, he's reinstating full diplomatic ties with Israel, reopening the Turkish embassy in Tel Aviv, reopening the Israeli embassy, returning the ambassadors to Tel Aviv and to Ankara. And I think that this can have strategic implications in terms of Iran. Israel, in my view, has an incredibly incompetent national leadership at this point, but even a broken clock can be right twice a day, and B, the strategic realities are what they are, and then the other aspect of that, of course, is the area that you, Victoria, have been dealing with so closely, which is the natural gas in the Eastern Europe in the Eastern Mediterranean. But if you wouldn't mind just to speak a bit to the regional strategic implications or dynamics at play that would get a guy like Erdogan, whether it's all economic, whether there are other things involved, to renew his ties with Israel, given how he feels about Israel and the Jewish state in general.
I think Erdogan, it's a very interesting question. And interestingly, I was at the political event last 2 days ago in which Ambassador David Friedman endorsed Dr. Oz. And we joked at the event that it was kismet that their interaction happened the day that Israel and Turkey restored formal relations. So, stranger things have happened. And in terms of Erdogan, everyone has to remember he is facing a truly failing economy. The lira's, right there with, the Venezuelan and Iranian currencies in total leper land. And he's got an election coming up. And so he is under enormous pressure, the likes of which I don't think he's ever faced. And so I think that explains some of these actions, that he needs the commerce with Israel. I can't remember. Dr. Oz had a stat. It's like 500,000 Israelis vacation, some huge number in Turkey. Okay. And there's the potential for a lot of mutually advantageous business. So I think that's issue number one. It also explains, incidentally, why Erdogan's so intent on playing the global statesman and brokering some sort of deal on Ukraine. He wants to be seen by his people as a very senior figure on the global stage, and that if he were replaced, they would lose that status. So I think that explains his motivation. In terms of the Eastern Med, again, he has not been making much progress on that. And I do think the withdrawal of U.S. support for the Eastern Mediterranean pipeline he sees as sort of an opening for him to start to play a more major role.
That links Israel and Cyprus and Greece to Italy, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, to Southern Europe. And it was interesting when it happened, because they announced they were no longer going to support that project. At the same time, they proposed linking the Greek and Cypriot and all of the regional electrical grids together to promote electrification. And I think, well, where are you going to get the electricity? That's always the problem for these people who want to make everything electric. Is it sounds great and it's nice and clean and everything's going to be bright and shiny, except you're not going to be able to turn the lights on because we're not going to have any actual juice. So I think Erdogan, and I would also posit Turkey has legitimate energy interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. No one's saying that they don't. I think the problem people have is in the way Erdogan has gone about it, which has been quite imperial. And he's constantly sort of ratcheting up tensions between Cyprus and I guess what you'd call Northern Cyprus, not letting that situation get resolved. So if he has decided to then I would assume for entirely pragmatic reasons, not because he's had a change of heart, but whatever, it doesn't matter. He decided to try to play a more constructive role so that Turkey can profit off of what is going to be an immensely profitable sector. I'm all for it. And I think we should talk to them, to their energy people, to their energy companies, figure out how we can get this equitably settled between everyone, because it's a huge potential boon for Europe and an alternative to Putin.
So Simon, I wanna bring it a little bit further to the north, which is Lebanon, and you have this is sort of a repeated theme on this show. I spoke with Tony Badran about this also, I think twice, that Israel is now in the final stages, apparently, according again to the media, of mediated talks with Lebanon about reaching some sort of an accord on the economic waters of Israel. Because Hezbollah does not accept, how surprising, the UN recognized economic waters of Israel in the Eastern Mediterranean, and they're demanding an expansion of Lebanon's economic waters. And I think this also has strategic ramifications, because anytime that the United States is insisting on pretending that there's a distinction between Hezbollah and Lebanon, which it swallowed, you have a situation where the United States is either willingly or unwittingly empowering Iran in the Eastern Mediterranean. That's my take on it. What do you think of continued U.S. military coordination, support for Lebanon, and the role that the United States is now playing in these talks between Lebanon and Israel? And obviously, Victoria will get the last word on this, but I want to start with Simone.
Well, I think it's embarrassing and absurd, to summarize my view. That's
deep. And profound.
Thanks. When I was in my old job, I actually fought against a lot of bureaucrats in the Defense Department, to no one's surprise, on this issue, because there's still a very deeply held and very misguided opinion that the Lebanese armed forces are somehow immune from the Hezbollahization of Lebanon, that they're, they say this privately, like they're our Christian friends, like the Lebanese armed forces are Christian, they're not Muslim, and therefore they have not been Hezbollahified. And so they're like, if all hell breaks loose in Lebanon, because we keep giving them money and training and equipment, they're going to be with the West, with us when the time comes, which, I think the three of us live in reality, not in the made up world of rainbows and unicorns. And we know how absurd that is and how dangerous that is. So unfortunately, that is the prevailing opinion among the smart people who have, all the big degrees. And so it's a very challenging situation for the reality-based people who want to sort of change. We want to change how the U.S. is doing business with Lebanon, i.e., cut, because we're not getting anything. I mean, anyway, I'm not going to go into it, but I think you understand what I'm saying. That they're not. They have been subsumed as well as the entire country has been by Hezbollah, and so yeah, it's very sad, and I think for a while we could rely on the Lebanese armed forces, and they were very good partners, and I think down perhaps at the individual unit level, where there's some leaders and soldiers who perhaps are with us as an organization. And I'll give an example. I was in my old job when the port disaster happened, the port explosion, and immediately the U.S. military aid kicked into action. We started filling planes with all kinds of stuff, with MREs, with water, with medical equipment. But thankfully, we recognized, and even Secretary Esper recognized that what we're sending is limited. We sent a limited number of planes. We limited what we were providing, and we also watched what happened to it after it got on the ground. Who came and picked it up, and where did it go? And what happened with that even small amount of aid that we provided and where it ended up going was not a good use of U.S. taxpayer money, and should be, a sign. It went straight to the hands of the Lebanese armed forces, and what they did with it was not in the best interests of the United States. So yes, I am a very strong advocate for cutting aid to Lebanon, and a more reality-based approach to what that country is and what it represents at this point.
So Victoria, specifically to the gas thing, my gravest concern about the deal that the United States is trying to strong arm Israel into agreeing to, and with our so competent leadership that we have right now in Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz, it looks like we're doing this. But it will actually, because of the nature of Lebanon today, turn Iran into an actor in the Eastern Mediterranean gas industry, because through Hezbollah, Iran controls Lebanon. And the question is how, if this goes through, is it going to impact, in your view, the whole gas situation in the Eastern Mediterranean? I mean, how do you see it?
Well, and I just have a quick footnote to what Simone said is the other thing that changed during the Trump administration, the corollary to the laugher, our great and good friends, and will be there for us at the end, is that Israel wanted the United States to continue the support to Lebanon, to keep Lebanon stable, to prevent there being another failed state on the northern border. That was true when we first came in. That was the message we were getting, but that shifted. And certainly by 2018, the message was, look, that thing's hopelessly broken. It cannot be fixed. And that's really the realization we have to come to, is that decades of engagement and hundreds of millions and billions.
Israel recognized this in 2018, is what you're saying. Israel shifted.
But it is failed. And pouring good money after bad, or bad money after good, isn't gonna change the situation. I think obviously everyone is deeply concerned about a Iranian intrusion into the Mediterranean, which is what they've wanted all along. That's why they're in Syria in the first place. And I think that is enormously problematic. The good news is that if we have Turkey more on board with our group, I think that makes their purview very, very small and hopefully containable, but it is in no way desirable or beneficial to anyone.
All right. Are there any other things you guys would like to say before we start wrapping up about Afghanistan, about the trajectory of the United States? I can just ask one last question, which I'd be happy if you could answer, which is just, I think American allies, American allies are in a state of constant whiplash with the United States, because you get a Democratic administration and it completely reverses the policies of a Republican administration and vice versa. And if God willing we get a Republican Congress in November, and if God willing we get a Republican president in 2025, what kind of policies can you develop that are going to have credibility over time, and how are American allies supposed to be looking at a situation where every policy is reversed by a new administration? I mean, the polarization of U.S. politics is having extraordinary influence or impact consequences for the Middle East. Who's going to take this really softball question?
Well, I went last time, so let Simone go first this time.
Yeah, I want Victoria to have the last word too. So I do. Long term, I am bullish on the United States. I'm not kind of like a doom and gloom person. And so I don't, we are.
And you're living in Texas now, so right?
It's, it's not all doom and gloom. You get a certain perspective inside the Beltway, and it's not really the way the rest of the country is. But no, we are certainly going through a very profoundly difficult period right now in the U.S. And I think it's playing out, in our foreign policy realm. And I know a lot of our partners are very disturbed by this. I don't think all is lost. I hope it's not. And as much as you can focus on all the bad things that are going on, it's also been a period of awakening, I think, for a lot of Americans who are just going through their lives, looking at not considering kind of these bigger important issues. So I think more people are paying attention now, and I think that's good, because we need an engaged citizenry, and I think that's what we're getting now, because people have been personally hurt by all these really bad policies. People are struggling right now. So I do think long term, I am hopeful, but there's a lot more to come before we get to the good part. Like Victoria said, if we're in the mid 70s right now, we have a few more years before we hit the 80s, and we have a lot of work to do. So I also I'm very sympathetic to this whiplash scenario where our partners feel whiplash. I know they do. And it also has to be incredibly difficult. I mean, it's so nice to have partners who they really want us to be strong and want us to succeed and mourn with us when our leadership makes such poor decisions. And I do think that since President Obama, there are norms that existed in our national security, that there were certain things that you just didn't touch, no matter who the administration was, no matter what party they were. There were certain constants that would never change, and that doesn't exist anymore. Unfortunately, there are very few of those left, and so I think that has resulted in even greater whiplash than before. I hope Victoria has an answer for that, because I don't. I think certainly in the short term, my hope is that there'll be another case of whiplash coming up here, because we can't continue in this way. And I hope that our arguments on the right are compelling enough, and people remember this period of time where the left has been leading us as so dark and so grim that they don't ever want to come back here again.
Okay.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And I do think we will have an increasingly emerging national consensus on China, and that the ability to build out as much as I disagree with it, there's a reason one of the few things Congress actually did pass in a bipartisan fashion was the CHIPS Act, because
right.
The concept of it, that we're going to prevent China from having a monopoly on our semiconductors, is sound. And everyone should agree on that. Now, what they did with it, I disagree with. But that to me was a hopeful signal that we can come together on this generational challenge, recognize it doesn't boil down to how many warships we can put in the Pacific, but that it is going to be a global struggle. And that we do have to approach our Middle East policy, for example, not in isolation, but in the context of that greater struggle. And, so for something like the US-Israel relationship, then, that becomes orders of magnitude more important, and it should be to everybody who's engaged in this struggle. And, the Iranian issue, if the Iranians are obviously complicit with the Chinese, that's going to make you think twice as well. So I think as we grow into that, as we wrap our brains around what that means, and we start to summon the national will to engage in the competition, across the board, and it'll be everything from nuclear weapons to doorbells, that they have weaponized everything. And so, as that reality dawns, I think you will have a cohesion of U.S. policy. There'll be differences, obviously, but I think the era of whiplash will end for that reason.
Okay. Well, God willing, you both are right, and that it should happen very soon, because America's that irreplaceable country. I think that it was Madeleine Albright who said it, although it might have been somebody else. But I mean, it certainly was a bipartisan sentiment for a very long time. And yeah, America's allies miss you. So anyway, all right. On that, how shall we say, bittersweet note of hope and faith. I think we can end it. I think we've covered some really important ground, and I think we should also take a moment really to remember all of the Americans who gave their lives for Afghanistan, and everything that has been sacrificed, and everything that was lost, and over time will hopefully be rebuilt and regained. So thank you both very much. And I'll be back next week. I think I'll be recording in Israel again at home. So I'll see you guys again next week. And in the meantime, thanks so much to Simone Ledeen and to Victoria Coates for joining me on this week's Middle East News Hour. Thanks so much.